So we're picking up in chapter 25 with the election of 1928. And we left off in the last video with the presidency of Coolidge. And in this election, he decided not to run again. So the Republican nomination went to Herbert Hoover, who was a successful businessman. He was a technocrat, a skilled bureaucrat, and he easily won the nomination. Coolidge, for personal reasons, detested him. I'm not sure why. That would be fun to look up, but he didn't like him. But Hoover believed that capital and labor could cooperate to achieve mutually beneficial goals. And so he opposed union busting, he opposed trust busting, and he thought that capitalists had curbed their selfish instincts, and that now the Carnegies and the Rockefellers, all of that mentality had sort of subsided. And his opponent was a New York Democrat named Alfred Smith. And in many ways, Smith was Hoover's antithesis. He was a Catholic anti-prohibitionist. He represented the urban immigrant, the machine-style politics of the nation's cities. He had lots of knowledge about blacks and immigrants, and Hoover simply lacked knowledge of blacks and immigrants. Despite that, Hoover won a smashing victory. So the prosperity of the 1920s did mask some serious flaws in the economy. And it would be ridiculous to think that everything was perfect during the 1920s, but a lot of times it goes unnoticed because it was a boom, like it was an economic boom. People did really well. But not all sectors of the economy shared in that prosperity. The coal industry, the cotton industry, lagged behind the general economy and led to falling profits and increasing unemployment. And the trend toward consolidation of industries, which had been checked during the progressive years, continued throughout the period. So in some ways, Herbert Hoover was wrong about the instincts of the wealthy capitalist. About 200 corporations controlled half of the nation's corporate assets, and GM, Ford, and Chrysler made 90% of the nation's cars. There were voluntary trade associations with government backing that now practice self-regulation, and basically they exchanged information, they discussed government policies, and they set prices for their industries. By far, though, the weakest sector of the economy during the 20s was agriculture. And farm prices were dropping and farming costs mounted. If you think about how expensive a tractor is and how it would be difficult to pay back the loan that you had taken out to pay for your tractor with falling agricultural prices. But this was sort of a weird cycle where with the tractor you could produce a lot more, but with a lot more production, there was too much stuff. Nobody could buy it all, so the prices went way, way, way down. So when the prices fell, farmers weren't able to recoup their costs, and they weren't able to pay back their loans. And so I think I said in the last video, they were forced to sell their surpluses abroad, and other nations had high import tariffs, so that didn't really work out very well either. While most economic indicators reflected unprecedented prosperity, this was built on unstable foundations. There was unequal distribution of resources that posed a great problem. Productive capacity raced way ahead of purchasing power. Again, more was being produced than could be bought. And large sums of money were invested in speculative ventures rather than in productive enterprises. And all of this helped contribute to the stock market crash of 1929. The stock market had raced ahead in early 1928 and prices still climbed higher during the first half of 1929. The market began to waver in September, but few people saw cause for serious concern during that time. But on October 29th, 1929, the stock market collapsed and the boom ended. More than 16 million shares were sold and prices plummeted. So the stock market collapse was more of a symptom of economic troubles than the cause of the Depression. Business activity didn't really decline until the spring of 1930. And it's important to remember that the Great Depression did not just affect the United States. The Great Depression was a worldwide phenomenon, and it was caused primarily by economic imbalances resulting from World War I. In the United States, you have the concentration of wealth, speculative investment, underconsumption, and this contributed to the severity of the Depression. And Hoover relied on volunteerism, in other words, private charities, churches, things like that, and mutual self-interest to cure the economic ills. And he would lend money to farmers and ease credit restrictions for banks, but he would not give direct relief. He would not give government handouts. And really, it was just because that extension of the federal government had never been done before. However, he did overestimate the willingness of citizens to act in the public interest without legal compulsion. And he relied too much on these voluntary corporations. They very quickly ran out of money. And as the Depression deepened, Hoover placed more of an emphasis on balancing the budget, which further decreased the supply of money. And his reasoning was, we expect people to live within their means, so the government should set a good example, which was definitely true, but maybe not the best solution for the Great Depression. So in the spring of 1932, thousands of Americans faced starvation. In Philadelphia, there was an 11-day period where no funds were available for relief, and families were living on stale bread, thin soup, and garbage. They were eating garbage. Some tenants even gave up on receiving their rents, and they just allowed families to continue staying there so that their places wouldn't be occupied by scavengers. Some people were evicted because they couldn't pay rent, and so they established these shanty towns that they called Hoovervilles, which was not meant as a compliment. And Hoover did take a lot of flack for his response to the Great Depression, but it's important to keep in mind that this was unprecedented. In American history, this level of depression had never racked the whole economy, virtually everyone. People begged for food while agricultural prices dropped so low that farmers organized farm holiday movements. And then in the summer of 1932, there were about 20,000 World War I vets who wanted their war bonuses, so they marched on Washington to seek immediate payment. And Congress rejected their appeal. Some of them refused to leave, and they established a camp outside, and federal troops had to disperse the bonus army. And it just seemed totally unpatriotic of our government to send our veterans away empty-handed. But the unprecedented severity of the Depression did lead to some proposals for radical economic and political change. And some people even turned to communism. They wanted a complete state mobilization of the economy, as there were stories of low unemployment in Russia. So the Depression had a profound psychological impact on the American people. You have to remember that there were simply no jobs to be found anywhere. And people who lost their jobs at first would go out and look for new ones. But after a few months, they just became apathetic. Like there was nothing they could do about it. And so this economic stress brought personal stress. And there were some wives who were sympathetic toward their husbands, and others who scorned their breadwinners when they came home without bread. Family size decreased, and there was a dramatic drop in the birth rate. It was the lowest in American history. And hopelessness, malnutrition, contributed to this condition during the Great Depression. So the election of 1932. So in this election, the Democrats chose Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he was challenging Republican nominee Herbert Hoover. And Roosevelt campaigned on optimism and grand solutions that were unspecified to the nation's economic woes. And people were desperate for change. And so they rallied to Roosevelt's promises of a New Deal, even though they weren't sure of the terms of that deal. Roosevelt proposed that the government take whatever steps were necessary to protect the people and public interests. And on his promises, he won with an electoral margin of 472 to 59. And so Hoover was pretty much done at that point. The last days of the Hoover administration saw the lowest points of the Depression. So I want to give you a timeline of the Great Depression, just to kind of give you an idea of how this thing went down. So we've already said October 29th, 1929, this was Black Tuesday. The stock market crashes, $16 billion in losses. Well, then from 1929 to 1932, there were 10,000 banks that failed, $2 billion in deposits that were lost, and 13 million people that were unemployed. So fast forward to March 1933. This is the third bank panic. More banks are closing, and FDR declared a bank holiday to stop a run on the banks. Basically, he forced all banks to close, and this would prevent a run on the banks. That's like when everyone goes at the same time and they pull all their money out at the same time, forcing the bank to close. So, and then in June 1933, the NRA begins. This is the National Recovery Administration, and 27,000 people find jobs in Civilian Conservation Corps camps. The CCC was a public work relief program operating from 1933 to 1942, I think, in the U.S., and this was for unemployed, unmarried men who came from relief families. And then in the fall of 1933, the U.S. unemployment rate had reached 24.9. So at this point, it's coming down a little bit. The Works Progress Administration, this operated from 1925 to 1938. This kind of messes up a timeline if you're creating one in order. But the WPA, later renamed as the Work Projects Administration, was the largest and probably most ambitious American New Deal agency, and they employed millions of unemployed people. Most of them were unskilled men, and they simply carried out public works projects like constructing public buildings and roads and things like that. 1938, Congress passes the Wages and Hours Act, and all this does is sets a minimum wage. Then in 1939, $1 billion is spent on the armed forces, and unemployment rate goes down to 17.2. And then in 1941, the United States enters World War II, and manufacturing goes up by 50%. And really, that is what probably contributed the most to bringing the United States out of the Great Depression. And we'll go ahead and finish our Chapter 25 video notes there.